Ahoy, you salty sailors. Time to raise anchor and set sail for your best scrawny life. Arr!
We've closed the fly fishing season out with the urban trout program once again. This time, instead of using the boat to my advantage, I limited myself to the bank and was looking for other ways to make the experience more challenging. And although in some cases it's still a bit too easy, there were some shoreline obstructions that required a curve cast. Again, not a terribly difficult technique to learn. Uh, and these remnant weed beds didn't prove terribly difficult, although this one sparse weed bed, the fish were moving through it rather than around it, and that actually proved a significant challenge. I did catch fish there, but most of the time I was fouling in the weeds and spooking them, and I didn't really have much of an answer for that situation. And this being an old mine pit, there were steep banks that proved difficult. The stealth aspect of the approach is a lot more difficult when you're climbing down a vertical rock bank. But now in this particular case, I stood on the above and observed the fish feeding on what appeared to be midge pupa, and I switched the fly from a unweighted leech to a size 10 unweighted leech pattern to a small midge pupa. And surprisingly, in spite of all the trout swimming around, the fish I caught there was a largemouth, a little largemouth. I did get out for one last river trip. I was in the first deep pool above the impoundment, but it seemed like the bigger fish had already moved clear down to the impoundment. Although it's great just to see the river so clear and the fall color and so forth. And I did eventually catch a small pike. Yep, that happened. And with that, we'll close out the season. And of course, now it's fly tying season. And to help this make a bit more sense, let's start with a chart. So in the early season, on the left-hand corner, in the uppermost position, we see pike spawn. What sort of a fly would we use for that? We need a very versatile fly because they could be on shallow gravel bars, they could be on mud flats, they could be in deep pools around dams. So we need a fly that's hook point up to avoid snagging the bottom. We need one that's heavy that gets down in those deep pools around the dams. And so we've got this sculpin helmet pattern here. Now you'll recall last year I was using those lightweight flies that had a dubbing ball with a big loop of other materials around it. I really don't like flies that change shape on the drop, though. This fly will look like a stone cat pretty much no matter what the fly is doing. And you'll notice I've bent the front of the articulation shank upward just a little bit. If you've seen the video afoot in Alden, then you've seen me lose a fish when the situation became very vertical below a dam. Because a J-hook, just a regular J-hook, can rotate if it's hooked when the hook is hook point up. It can rotate out of a fish's mouth when the hook is pulled from straight above. And so this bend in the hook will hopefully help us with that verticality problem, but also because the sculpin helmets, the weight distribution is not perfect, and sometimes they roll over on their backs. So just bending the eye of that articulation shank up a bit will help with that as well. Now, apart from those details about the head of the fly, this is an extremely simple construction, just a 1/4 inch strip of black craft fur polymered up the shank with some super glue. So staying in that far left column, below pike spawn we see walleye run, and this could also include the white bass and wiper run on the Des Moines and Iowa rivers. In either case, we're going to be not far below a dam, and we'll most likely be standing on a quite steep bank. So we'll be using micro Skagit gear and probably swinging flies in most cases. And you'll recall that last year, the swing flies I was using uh, were brightly colored feathers that ran all the way back and covered the hook or bucktail that did the same. It protected the hook because I'd had trouble snagging the bottom in those sorts of areas before, rocky areas below dams. Uh, but I missed a lot of strikes with those flies to the extent that by the end of the year I was not fishing them anymore. And the bright colors were an attempt to help the fish find the fly if the water happened to be high and muddy, which last year it wasn't. Uh, but I'm not really sure how well these fish actually see in color. At any rate, some barred schlappen feathers showed up just at random in the Des Moines Bass Pro Shop, and so I grabbed a pack of those. So this year we're going with a two-stage hackle intruder, and we're just counting on some strands of crystal flash to help the fish find the fly if the water happens to be muddy. Now, all of these flies have the hook more exposed than the flies I started out with last year, but some of them I'm using a bucktail wing that runs back and protects the hook a little bit, and in others I've gotten rid of that bucktail wing. It's just some strands of crystal flash and a couple hackle feathers. So there's varying degrees of hook exposure, and hopefully we won't miss any strikes this year. I need to stress that it's very different than the coastal salmon rivers where this type of fishing was developed. Sometimes we're lucky and we're able to wade, but most of the time we're confined to the bank below a dam. So we're already quite high above the water. Instead of using a long rod, I'm using a short rod, generally an 8-foot rod, because I'm already so high above the water. Generally, I'm using a 12-foot shooting head with a 5-foot sink tip that gets incorporated into the D-loop. We're anchoring only in the leader. The D-loop has to be extremely shallow. The distance behind the angler to the bank might only be a couple feet, and we're forced to anchor in front into the weakest position rather than behind like those coastal salmon rivers. So everything is weaker. Shorter rod, shorter casting stroke, lighter shooting heads, extremely shallow D-loop, and placing the anchor in front of the angler. So that is why these flies are so sparse. There's no bunny strip, there's no Arctic fox, there's nothing that's going to absorb or carry a bunch of water into the setup for the cast. So forget about mile-wide coastal salmon rivers. These are small, steep-sided old mill dams in small towns, small rivers, uh, shallow D-loop anchor in front. The weakest type of position, so the flies have to be very sparse. There's no bunny strip, no Arctic fox, and nothing that absorbs a bunch of water and gets heavy. Now, when the ice first goes out of the ponds, the sun in the southern half of the sky shines down and warms the northern shoreline of the ponds first. And so, and you may also have a southerly wind that's pushing warm water as well as midges and food items to the north shore of a pond. So that tends to attract bluegills, bass, but the fly we're going to focus on here, and we're not trying to cover every conceivable pattern, but the fly we're focusing on here is a size 10 beadhead woolly bugger tied on that 60-degree streamer hook, and we're targeting crappie with this fly, although we could catch any of the 3 species I've mentioned. Now, switching back to the rivers, if between snowmelt and the spring rains, we have a bit of a gap where we have low, clear river conditions. There can be some good fishing centered around the stonefly emergence. And in this case, we'll focus simply on the larva. And I've doubled the size of it, basically. The natural is a size 12 to a size 10, and I've tied this on a size 6 hook. It's wire weighted, simple, buggy, made of a single body feather from a wild turkey. And we're using a strong forged hook because while it's possible to catch smallmouth and walleye and so forth on stonefly nymphs, this is primarily a carp pattern. We'll be targeting carp with this fly. And make no mistake, if you hit this just right, it can be a raging load of fun. This early season carp pattern was where I set my personal best record of 14 carp in one outing. And it can be a wild time if you hit it just right. So now, in moving over to the April-May column, we start out with largemouth spawn. Anyone who's fished for nesting bass knows they can be pretty tricky, and this could include smallmouth bass as well if we have low river conditions at that time. So it's weighted to swim with the hook point above the shank in case we're throwing this to smallmouth nesting in a rock bottom river. We've got a monofilament weed guard in case we're throwing this to largemouth in a weedy lake. It will nose down. It's heavy. It'll sink quickly. It will nose down around that nest. Now, a fly this size is unlikely to be eaten by a bass that's guarding a nest. If it they're not looking to slow themselves down on a large meal at this time. So if it as the retrieve continues and if the fly moves away from the nest, the bass is most likely to just let it go. Whereas a smaller pattern would perhaps have been eaten. So here's a smaller version of the same thing, but still tied on a hook that's strong enough to actually fight and land a large bass. But in either case, it's more likely to get a good eat from a bass that's building its nest that hasn't spawned yet. And in all these cases, we're dealing with relatively shallow fish that could be spooked if the fly makes a loud plop when it enters the water. So that's why we're tying with these fuzzy dubbing loops that run all the way up around the dumbbell eyes and so forth. Of course, decelerating the cast correctly is a factor in that too. But we'll have a nice fuzzy fly that makes a soft landing. For the crappie spawn, let's use the same size 10 60-degree beadhead woolly bugger we used at ice out, except now with the addition of a hackle collar for some movement and to slow the sink rate. So now in the second column, the third from the top, we find it's time for the carp and gar to begin spawning. For gar, we'll again use the same tube fly that's backed up with a treble hook with the barbs pinched down for safety. If we need extra weight, we can slide a single metal bead onto the tippet before before inserting the tippet into the tube and tying on the treble. Now, you'll notice that we've dressed the treble hook with a pinch of synthetic hair. That is simply to help the hook decelerate. It does not, we're not trying to catch a gar by entangling its teeth. The problem with that is, how do you disentangle the gar and get your fly back? High likelihood of being bitten with something like that. We want these fibers to slide past the teeth, and we want to catch the gar with the hook. Now, you'll notice this fly, most of the bucktail broken off. This fly has seen action, well worn. Simple tube fly tied on the plastic tube of a cotton swab, and you'll notice those final thread wraps have received a bit of extra glue to help it survive the encounter. Now it looks like we're running out of time. It looks like this will turn into a 2 or perhaps 3-part series. So we'll have to take up the carp spawn in the next video. See you then.